The morning air was crisp, a hint of winter still clinging to the early hours as Director Jonathan Reeves navigated the quiet streets of Arlington. He had left his house before sunrise, preferring to get a head start on the day before the chaos of meetings and briefings at FBI headquarters. His black Chevrolet Suburban cruised down a stretch of road not far from his office, the tinted windows shielding him from curious eyes. It was a routine drive, until it wasn't. Red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. A single police cruiser followed closely behind, its siren wailing for only a moment before shutting off. Reeves frowned. He wasn't speeding, hadn't run a light. Something felt off. He slowed to a stop, pulling onto the shoulder. Before he could roll down his window, a uniformed officer approached with his firearm drawn. "Hands where I can see them," the cop barked. Reeves blinked, his hand hovering over his ID wallet. "Officer, I'm out of the car. Now." Reeves' pulse quickened, but he complied. The door clicked open, and he stepped out slowly, both hands raised. The officer, a young man with tense shoulders and a clenched jaw, kept his gun trained on him. Face down on the ground. "You need to listen to me," Reeves said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Director Reeves of the..." "Now," the officer shouted. The moment stretched thin. Reeves debated his options. He knew any sudden movement could escalate the situation dangerously. His badge was inside his jacket, but reaching for it would be a risk. He took a slow breath. Behind him, a second officer stepped out of the cruiser, hand on his own holstered weapon. "What's going on?" the second cop asked, a note of uncertainty in his voice. "I caught him speeding." "He refused to stop at first," the first officer said quickly. "That's not true," Reeves interjected. "Shut up." The officer's hand trembled slightly. "On the ground, now." Reeves knew the signs. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong, it was fear, or worse, intent. He remained standing, his expression unreadable. The second officer hesitated, studying Reeves. Then his eyes flicked to the black SUV, its government plates, the faint outline of an official emblem on the windshield. Recognition dawned. "Wait," he said, lowering his hand from his weapon. "Sir, can I see some ID?" "Inside my jacket," Reeves said evenly. The first officer shook his head. "No, he's stalling." But the second cop had already stepped forward, brushing past his partner. He reached into Reeves' jacket carefully and pulled out the leather badge case. One flip, and his face went pale. "Shit." He turned to his partner. "Put the gun down. Now." The first officer's face twisted with confusion, then realization. His grip on the gun faltered. "Do it," the second officer barked. Slowly, reluctantly, the gun lowered. Reeves exhaled, his stance unwavering. "Step away from him," the second cop ordered his partner. Then, into his radio, "Dispatch, we have a situation. Subject identified as FBI Director Jonathan Reeves. Request immediate supervisor on scene." A tense silence followed. The first officer's chest rose and fell rapidly. Reeves watched him carefully. "What's your name?" The officer swallowed. "Henderson." "You made a mistake, Officer Henderson." Reeves' voice was measured, but his eyes were cold. "A serious one." Within minutes, more squad cars arrived, along with Arlington PD's captain. The moment the senior officer stepped out, his face turned a shade paler than the second cop's had. "Director Reeves," he said hurriedly, approaching. Sir, what happened?" Reeves didn't answer. He was watching Henderson, who now stood rigid, his hands at his sides. "Arrest him," Reeves said. The captain stiffened. "Sir. For unlawful use of force, abuse of authority, and endangering a federal officer." There was no arguing. The second officer hesitated only a moment before moving forward, pulling Henderson's hands behind his back. "You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning began. Reeves watched as the cuffs clicked into place. It was only then that he allowed himself a slow breath. The day was just beginning. As the cuffs clicked shut around Officer Henderson's wrists, the tension in the air didn't dissipate, it seemed to amplify. The gathered officers stood in silence, uncertain of how to proceed. Some avoided making eye contact with Reeves, while others simply stared at the ground. The reality of what had just happened was setting in. Reeves, however, was unyielding in his demeanor. He knew better than anyone how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control, especially with the media constantly watching. He needed to ensure that the situation was handled discreetly but firmly. His reputation, the agency's credibility, and the trust placed in law enforcement all hung in the balance. "Take him away," Reeves said to the second officer, his voice steady. The officer nodded, though there was still a palpable hesitation in his movements as he escorted Henderson to one of the squad cars. Henderson's face was flushed with embarrassment, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, fear, perhaps. Reeves couldn't help but wonder what had driven the officer to make such a reckless decision in the first place. The captain, who had been standing off to the side, walked over to Reeves once Henderson was safely in the car. "I'll make sure the investigation is thorough, sir," the captain said, his tone strained but respectful. Reeves nodded curtly. "Make sure it's swift." Without waiting for a response, he turned toward his vehicle. The captain's words were almost drowned out by the roar of the engine as the Suburban came to life again. The doors closed behind him with a firm click, and the officers watched as the FBI director's vehicle pulled back onto the road. Inside the car, Reeves exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He was shaken, but not in the way he might have expected. In truth, he had been in far more dangerous situations, faced real threats on multiple occasions. This was a different kind of betrayal, one from within. He glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing only his own reflection. It felt surreal, even more so because it had been so sudden. One moment, he was just another driver, another person on the road, and the next, he had been detained, disarmed, and treated like a criminal by someone in uniform. "God help me," he muttered under his breath. His thoughts were interrupted as his phone buzzed in the center console. He grabbed it, glancing at the screen. It was a text message from Deputy Director Mitchell. "Mitchell, we've got eyes on the situation. Preparing statements for the press. Call me ASAP." Reeves typed a quick reply, his fingers moving with practiced precision. "Reeves, already on it. Don't let the press jump to conclusions." He hit send and placed the phone back in the holder. His mind was already moving faster than his car. There was no time to waste, he needed to get to the office and address this. The longer this dragged on, the more the media would speculate, and that could fuel a fire he couldn't control. Less than 15 minutes later, Reeves arrived at the FBI headquarters. He was greeted by his senior staff in the lobby, all looking concerned, but none daring to ask questions before he did. They knew better than to speak without being spoken to first. Reeves didn't waste time. He walked straight to his office, his staff following in silence. Once the door shut behind him, he exhaled deeply, his shoulders dropping for the first time since the incident. "I want a full report," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Get me every detail you can find on Officer Henderson. I want to know what triggered him to act the way he did. And make sure the local PD knows we're not going to let this go." His team nodded, already moving to their respective tasks. "Sir," Agent Thomas called, breaking the silence. "We've got footage from the dash cam. It's all on record. The way he approached, the way he held the gun, everything." "Good," Reeves said, his eyes narrowing. "Make sure it gets to the right hands. The last thing we need is the wrong narrative spreading." He sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. There was a sickening weight settling in his stomach, a realization that this could be far bigger than just one rogue officer. This was a crack in the system. Also, Reeves said, his voice hardening, get me in touch with the Attorney General. I want this handled at the federal level. If anyone tries to sweep this under the rug, we need to have leverage. His staff quickly began making calls, their voices hushed as they moved in every direction to gather information. As for Reeves, he didn't sit idle. He reached for his phone once again, dialing Mitchell's number. "Mitchell, this is going to be a mess," he said the moment the line clicked open. "I need you to handle damage control. We need to get ahead of this before the media spins it out of control. Set up a press conference for later today. Make it clear that this incident is being taken seriously." Mitchell's voice was steady. "We'll make sure the right message gets out, sir. I'll start drafting statements." Reeves paused, watching his reflection in the glass walls of his office. The day had started with a simple drive, and now it was spiraling into a crisis that had the potential to shake the entire law enforcement community. "Be ready for anything, Mitchell," Reeves warned, his voice quiet but filled with a weight that only years of experience could bring. "This isn't just about one officer. This is about trust. And that's not something we can afford to lose." "Understood," Mitchell replied. Reeves ended the call and leaned back in his chair. He wasn't just thinking about the immediate fallout, he was already considering the long-term implications. If the public learned that one of their own had been so easily manipulated, so easily swayed into betraying his oath, it would cause a ripple effect. He would need to move swiftly, decisively, and with precision. And he had to be prepared for the storm that was about to hit. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and briefings. Reeves barely had time to digest what had just happened, let alone process it. His entire team was working around the clock, gathering evidence, speaking to witnesses, and coordinating with local law enforcement to make sure the investigation into Officer Henderson was thorough and transparent. But despite their efforts, the story had already started to break. By late morning, news outlets had picked up the incident, and the first wave of media reports hit. The headline, "FBI Director Held at Gunpoint by Officer During Routine Traffic Stop," was explosive, to say the least. The initial reaction from the public was a mix of disbelief and outrage. How could something like this happen? A police officer, one who had sworn an oath to protect and serve, pointing a gun at a federal officer? Reeves knew the headlines were just the beginning. His phone had been ringing non-stop, reporters clamoring for information, elected officials demanding answers, and the general public voicing their anger. By the time the press conference was set up, the pressure had reached a boiling point. Mitchell had been working closely with the PR team, drafting a statement that would strike the right tone. It had to be firm, decisive, and reassuring. But it also had to acknowledge the seriousness of the incident without fanning the flames of public distrust. Reeves stood in front of the podium, his jaw set and his hands clasped in front of him. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones extended toward him. It was a scene he had dealt with many times before. Press conferences were part of the job. But this one felt different. The stakes were higher. The entire agency's integrity was on the line. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. "I'm here today to address a situation that occurred earlier this morning involving one of our nation's law enforcement officers and myself. I want to make it clear that this incident is being treated with the utmost seriousness." He paused for a moment, letting the words settle before continuing. "At approximately 7:30 a.m., I was stopped by Officer Henderson of the Arlington Police Department. During this stop, the officer, for reasons we are still investigating, drew his weapon and threatened my life. This was an unacceptable and unprovoked act. Thankfully, the situation was de-escalated, and no one was injured." The room buzzed with murmurs, and Reeves could see the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. He took another breath and pressed on. I want to emphasize that this was not an ordinary traffic stop. As the director of the FBI, I have a responsibility to uphold the law and ensure the safety of my fellow citizens, but I am also a citizen myself. I do not take kindly to threats of violence, and I certainly will not tolerate any actions that undermine the trust between law enforcement agencies and the people they serve. He glanced around the room, making sure to meet the eyes of the reporters. The officer in question has been placed under arrest and is being held pending further investigation. I have instructed our Internal Affairs Division to work closely with Arlington PD to ensure that this matter is handled with transparency and accountability. He paused again, his gaze hardening. This incident raises serious concerns, not just about the actions of one officer, but about the systemic issues that may be at play. While this is an isolated case, it serves as a reminder of the importance of trust in law enforcement. We cannot afford to lose that trust, and I will do everything in my power to make sure that we rebuild it. There was a moment of silence before the first question came. Director Reeves, can you tell us what exactly led Officer Henderson to stop you? A reporter asked. Reeves shook his head slightly. At this time, we are still looking into the specifics of why the officer took such drastic action. We are reviewing dash-cam footage and other evidence. What I can tell you is that I did not break any laws, and the officer had no reasonable grounds to draw his weapon in the manner that he did. Another reporter chimed in. There are reports that Officer Henderson had a history of misconduct. Can you confirm that? Reeves' eyes tightened. I can confirm that we are thoroughly investigating Officer Henderson's background. If any previous misconduct is uncovered, it will be addressed appropriately. However, the focus right now is on the actions he took today and how they escalated to the point of endangering my life. He could sense the shift in the room. Some reporters were still skeptical, but others seemed to be softening their stance, taking in the gravity of the situation. Reeves continued to speak, answering questions as best as he could, all the while remaining calm and composed. But inside, his mind was working overtime. What had gone wrong? What had caused Henderson to act so irrationally? The officer's past behavior was still unclear, but Reeves knew that the investigation would soon uncover the truth. There was always a bigger story behind such moments of violence, something that would explain the officer's mindset, his motivations. Was it a personal issue? A history of stress or mental health problems? Or was there something deeper at play, something systemic within the department that had gone unnoticed until now? As the press conference came to a close, Reeves made one final statement. I want to assure the American people that the FBI will hold all law enforcement officers, including ourselves, to the highest standards of accountability. We will not allow this incident to define us, but we will use it as an opportunity to strengthen the bonds of trust that hold us together as a nation. I will personally ensure that this investigation is conducted with the transparency and integrity it deserves. With that, the room fell silent, and the reporters began to shuffle out, their questions lingering in the air. Reeves stood there for a moment longer, his thoughts swirling. He had said what needed to be said, but he knew the hard part was just beginning. The fallout from this would be felt for weeks, if not months. The investigation into Henderson would take time, but the real work would be in the recovery, both within the FBI and in the eyes of the public. The trust had been shaken, but Reeves was determined to restore it. The damage had been done, but it didn't have to define the future. It was up to him, and to the countless law enforcement officers dedicated to doing the right thing, to ensure that the principles of justice, integrity, and accountability would prevail. As he walked out of the press room, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. One that would require more than just answers. It would require a reckoning. The days after the press conference were a blur of activity, but the weight of the situation never left Jonathan Reeves. Every hour, every minute seemed to stretch as more information poured in. The media was relentless, the questions incessant. Public opinion was divided. Some rallied behind him, praising his handling of the situation and his commitment to transparency. Others, however, were more critical, questioning how such an incident could have occurred in the first place, and whether the FBI had failed to ensure its officers and local law enforcement were properly vetted and held accountable. Behind the scenes, Reeves' team was working overtime to get to the bottom of the situation. Dashcam footage from the incident was reviewed repeatedly, analyzed for every detail. Interviews with witnesses, other officers at the scene, pedestrians who had seen the stop, were conducted. And while the investigation into Officer Henderson's past was ongoing, early reports suggested that he had no history of violent behavior, but had been reprimanded for minor infractions in the past, things like tardiness and failure to follow protocol during routine situations. It wasn't enough to explain what had happened, but it did suggest that something had triggered the officer's behavior on that fateful morning. Reeves was meeting with his inner circle when Mitchell walked into his office, carrying a thick file. "Director," Mitchell began, glancing at the stack of papers in his hands. "We've made progress. The investigation into Henderson is moving forward. We've got his internal records, and while they don't suggest a predisposition to violence, there are some concerning elements that we need to address." Reeves nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Tell me." Mitchell sat down, flipping open the file. "We've interviewed some of Henderson's colleagues. They all describe him as a decent officer, well-intentioned, if a little hot-headed at times. But what's alarming is his recent behavior. He'd been complaining about pressure from his department. There were reports of personal issues he hadn't disclosed, stress, family problems, the usual. But there's one thing that stood out." Reeves raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "His recent interactions with his supervisors. Apparently, he'd been getting into heated arguments with his captain and some senior officers. One of his colleagues reported that he'd mentioned feeling overlooked and underappreciated by higher-ups. We didn't think it was relevant at first, but it seems that his frustration with the system might have played a role in his actions." Mitchell paused. "It's possible that he felt disrespected by your presence this morning, though that doesn't excuse his actions in any way." Reeves absorbed this new information. It wasn't conclusive, but it painted a picture of a man under strain, someone who felt marginalized and, perhaps, wanted to assert control over a situation where he had none. The weight of his own personal struggles had, it seemed, collided with the high-pressure environment of law enforcement, and the result was a catastrophic miscalculation. "So, he's just another officer who cracked under pressure?" Reeves asked, his voice sharp. Mitchell hesitated before answering. "It's not that simple. There's more. We've started looking into the broader context. Henderson wasn't the only one in the department who'd been vocal about dissatisfaction with his work environment. We're starting to see a pattern." He paused. "Some officers feel alienated from their leadership. There's a growing distrust within the department, a disconnect between officers on the ground and the command structure. It's not a crisis yet, but it's brewing." Reeves leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. This wasn't just about one officer, one incident. It was about something deeper, a culture of frustration, neglect, and a lack of support that was festering in the ranks. Henderson was the result of that systemic issue, a symptom of something far more insidious. "We can't let this become a narrative about rogue officers or personal failure," Reeves said, his voice low. "We have to take this as a sign that the system needs to change. From the top down. Otherwise, we risk this happening again, maybe not with an FBI director, but with someone else who doesn't have the training or the stability to handle a moment like this." Mitchell nodded. "I agree, Director. We've already started drafting recommendations for how we can address this: better mental health support, more open channels for officers to communicate their concerns, and a deeper look into how departments are managing internal conflicts. But it's going to take time to implement those changes, especially on a national scale." Reeves' eyes hardened. "Time isn't something we have right now. We need to move quickly, or this will spiral into a full-blown crisis. Public trust is at stake. The American people need to see us taking action." His mind raced through the options. The press, the public, even the police unions were demanding answers. He couldn't afford to wait. Set up a national summit on law enforcement reform, he ordered. We'll invite representatives from local and federal agencies, mental health experts, and advocacy groups. We need to show that we're not just reacting to this incident, we're proactively addressing the larger issue. Get it on the calendar for next week. Mitchell's eyes widened, clearly impressed by the speed with which Reeves had already formulated a plan. I'll get the ball rolling, sir. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Reeves spent hours coordinating with his team, meeting with experts in law enforcement, and drafting new guidelines for improving officer well-being. He knew the clock was ticking. The longer the investigation into Henderson dragged on, the greater the risk that the media would seize control of the narrative and turn the story into something much larger than it already was. When the summit finally took place, it was held in a massive conference room at FBI headquarters. The room was packed with stakeholders from across the country: police chiefs, sheriffs, federal agents, mental health professionals, community leaders, and even a few representatives from the Department of Justice. The atmosphere was tense, everyone aware of the gravity of the moment. Reeves took the stage first, addressing the audience with a calm yet firm voice. "I want to begin by thanking everyone for being here today," he said. "We're here because we've reached a point where law enforcement as a profession is at a crossroads. Recent events have highlighted the deepening divides within the system, and the reality is this: if we don't address these issues head-on, we risk losing the trust of the very communities we are sworn to protect." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. What happened with Officer Henderson is not an isolated incident, it's a reflection of a broader issue within law enforcement. We have officers who are overworked, undertrained, and struggling with personal issues that go unaddressed. It's time we acknowledge this and take concrete action. The summit lasted for hours, discussions flowing from one panel to the next. Reeves listened intently, but his mind was always a step ahead, thinking about how he could turn these conversations into meaningful change. By the end of the day, they had a comprehensive plan, one that focused on improving officer mental health, increasing transparency in internal investigations, and creating a stronger connection between law enforcement leadership and the officers on the ground. As the summit concluded, Reeves felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't a solution to the problem, not yet, but it was a start. The real work, he knew, was just beginning. The summit was a milestone, but it was only the first step. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on Reeves and his team intensified. The media coverage continued, though it had somewhat shifted in tone. The immediate shock of the incident was beginning to fade, but the questions remained. Public interest in the details of Henderson's background and the systemic issues within law enforcement didn't die down. If anything, it became more focused, more insistent. Reeves' inbox was flooded daily with letters from concerned citizens, police reform advocates, and even other law enforcement agencies who were now questioning the effectiveness of the current system. Everyone had an opinion. But one thing became increasingly clear: the demands for change were not going to be easily ignored. In the midst of this, the investigation into Officer Henderson was drawing closer to its conclusion. The local PD and FBI's internal affairs were working together, combing through every piece of evidence, interviews, records, and, most crucially, more of Henderson's personal history. The officer had been on administrative leave while the investigation continued, and during this time, his life outside of work came under even greater scrutiny. Reeves had insisted on transparency throughout the process, despite the potential fallout. He knew that for the agency and law enforcement as a whole to come out of this crisis with any shred of credibility, they had to be seen as willing to hold their own accountable. Every finding, no matter how minor or uncomfortable, needed to be addressed. It was the only way forward. As it turned out, Henderson's personal troubles were more complex than anyone had initially realized. The officer had been battling with deep-seated depression, an issue he had hidden from his colleagues. Though there had been some counseling available to him, he hadn't used the resources offered by his department. He had also been part of a growing trend within the police community, the growing stigma around seeking help for mental health issues. The officer had resisted reaching out for help, perhaps fearing it would make him appear weak in the eyes of his peers. The consequences of that refusal were now painfully evident. Reeves sat in his office late one night, reviewing the latest report. The weight of it all was starting to sink in. Henderson had been a product of a system that had not only failed him but had failed every officer who struggled silently with personal demons. And in some ways, the public was right to question the integrity of the system. They weren't just questioning Henderson's actions, they were questioning the very framework of law enforcement. Reeves knew that addressing the root causes of Henderson's actions would require sweeping reform. It wasn't just about training officers better or giving them more resources. It was about changing the culture, the unspoken expectations, the pressure to always be strong, to never show weakness. If this kind of change didn't come from the top down, it would never be accepted from the ground up. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Director, we've got news," Mitchell said, walking into the room. His expression was grim. "Henderson's been formally charged. He's been booked on charges of attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and multiple counts of misconduct. He'll be arraigned next week." Reeves nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He had expected this, but the reality of it still stung. What about the broader investigation into the department? It's ongoing. We've received reports from several officers about feeling unsupported, about leadership being too disconnected from the officers on the ground. This isn't just one bad apple, sir. This is a problem that goes deeper. Mitchell paused, his voice lowering. There are whispers of others feeling the same way Henderson did. This isn't going to be a quick fix. Reeves exhaled, his mind already turning toward the next phase of action. The investigation had uncovered just how severe the disconnect was between the officers and their leadership. The culture of silence and stigmatization of mental health had created a situation where officers who needed help the most were too afraid to ask for it. "We're going to have to move fast," Reeves said, his voice determined. "This goes beyond Henderson. We need to address the culture, the environment in these departments. If we're not proactive, if we don't lead by example, we're just going to see more of this." He picked up the phone and dialed Mitchell. "Get the team together. We need to put together a proposal for reform, mental health support systems, mandatory counseling, greater transparency in internal affairs, and a full audit of training programs. We're going to build a national program to change the way law enforcement handles officer well-being." Mitchell's voice came through clearly on the other end. "Understood. We're already working with some mental health professionals on this. I'll make sure we have something to present soon." As the days turned into weeks, the work began. Reeves spearheaded the initiative, personally overseeing the creation of the reform proposal. It was comprehensive. Officers would have access to anonymous mental health screenings, mandatory counseling sessions for those dealing with stress, burnout, or personal struggles, and a greater emphasis on emotional resilience in their training. The culture of silence was the first thing they needed to break down. Law enforcement had to start seeing mental health the same way they saw physical health. Both were essential to doing the job effectively. But as the proposal came together, the nation's attention turned to the trial of Officer Henderson. It was a media circus, and the prosecution and defense presented their arguments, dissecting the events of that morning in excruciating detail. The trial exposed Henderson's troubled state of mind and his failures to seek help, but it also raised larger questions about how law enforcement agencies dealt with the mental health of their officers. The tension reached a climax when the defense tried to argue that Henderson had been pushed to the brink by the pressures of his job, and that the system had failed him. It was an argument that resonated with some, and one that added fuel to the ongoing debate about the culture of law enforcement. There were calls for deeper scrutiny, not just of Henderson's actions but of the very framework that had allowed him to get to that point. Reeves watched the trial unfold, knowing that the outcome, no matter which way it went, wouldn't change the fundamental issues at the heart of this crisis. But he also knew that this was the moment to push forward with his reforms. The public, the officers, the politicians, everyone was watching. He had the attention of the nation, and now he had to make sure the right changes were put into motion. By the time the trial came to an end, with Henderson found guilty and sentenced to prison, Reeves was already in the midst of implementing his reform program. The process wouldn't be quick, but the change had begun. More officers were enrolling in mental health programs, leadership was becoming more engaged with the issues facing their teams, and a new standard of accountability was beginning to take root. The storm was far from over, but Reeves knew that the agency was stronger for having faced this moment head-on. The road ahead would be long, but with each step, the trust that had been broken was slowly, surely being repaired. As the months passed, the initial shock of the incident began to fade, but the work was far from over. Reeves' reform initiatives were in full swing, and while progress was being made, there were still significant hurdles to overcome. The road to change was never straightforward, and with every step forward, there seemed to be a challenge lurking just around the corner. Reeves had made it clear from the start that the goal wasn't simply to resolve this one issue, but to create lasting, systemic change within law enforcement. That meant tackling the culture, addressing the stigma surrounding mental health, and fostering an environment where officers could speak up without fear of judgment or retaliation. At the same time, the FBI's relationship with local police departments across the country had begun to change. The collaboration between federal and local agencies had always been a crucial part of law enforcement, but the tension between the two had been growing in the wake of the incident with Henderson. While many local agencies supported the reforms, others felt that the FBI's involvement in internal matters, especially mental health, was an overreach. Reeves understood the complexities. He wasn't trying to take control of local police departments, but rather to ensure that they had the support and tools they needed to address the growing crisis. He spent weeks traveling across the country, meeting with police chiefs, local government officials, and even rank-and-file officers. The aim was to bridge the gap and build trust between the FBI and local forces. It wasn't always easy. Some agencies were hesitant to adopt new reforms, fearing that it would expose their shortcomings. Others were outright resistant to any kind of oversight, no matter how well-intentioned. But gradually, a consensus began to form. By late summer, Reeves had managed to secure a partnership with the National Police Association to implement a nationwide mental health initiative. This collaboration would provide free, anonymous mental health screenings for officers, as well as a network of counselors trained specifically in dealing with the unique pressures of law enforcement. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Reeves knew that the fight wasn't just about implementing these programs, it was about changing the very way law enforcement viewed mental health, making it as integral to an officer's well-being as physical fitness. Meanwhile, the fallout from the Henderson case was still being felt within the Arlington Police Department. While many of the department's officers had expressed support for the investigation and the changes that were being implemented, some remained uneasy. The internal investigation had revealed several shortcomings in how the department handled officer well-being, and many felt that their leadership had failed them. In response, Reeves had pushed for further training for both officers and leadership in understanding and addressing mental health issues within their ranks. As fall approached, the public discourse around the Henderson case had shifted again. The trial, while widely covered, had raised critical questions about the role of law enforcement in maintaining mental health and the systemic failures that led to Henderson's actions. The general public, once quick to vilify the officer, now began to see him more as a victim of an overwhelmed system. There was a growing understanding that the problem wasn't just with Henderson, it was with how law enforcement agencies had handled stress, trauma, and mental health for years. Reeves knew that part of the healing process would involve rethinking how the FBI and local departments engaged with the community. Law enforcement had to become not just a force for enforcing the law, but a partner in the communities they served. He pushed for more outreach programs, more opportunities for officers to interact with citizens outside of the typical enforcement context. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but these were the kinds of cultural shifts that had to take place for long-term change. By early winter, the FBI had launched a national task force focused solely on the mental health of law enforcement officers. The task force, made up of professionals from various fields, psychologists, counselors, law enforcement veterans, was tasked with developing policies, training programs, and support networks specifically designed to help officers deal with the unique stressors of their jobs. It was an ambitious project, one that would take years to fully implement, but it was a step in the right direction. The media attention had largely died down by now, but Reeves had become a figurehead in the push for reform. While he had never sought the spotlight, he knew that his role in spearheading these changes was crucial. The public needed to see that the FBI and law enforcement as a whole were taking the issue seriously. The narrative was beginning to shift from one of scandal to one of reform. Reeves was determined to keep it that way. As winter settled in, Reeves reflected on how far they had come, but also how far they still had to go. The Henderson case had opened a wound in law enforcement, one that would take time to heal. But the reforms, the partnerships, and the growing awareness were all part of the healing process. And in that, Reeves found a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fixing what had gone wrong, it was about creating a system that would never allow something like this to happen again. One evening, as Reeves sat in his office, reviewing a progress report on the task force, there was a knock at the door. He looked up to see Mitchell standing in the doorway, holding a manila envelope. "Director, I have the latest update from Arlington PD," Mitchell said, walking in and handing him the file. "They've agreed to adopt the new mental health training program we recommended. They're also implementing some of the reforms we discussed about leadership and officer engagement." Reeves took the file, a small but significant victory. "Good news. That's one step in the right direction." Mitchell hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's more. We've also received a report from the DOJ. They're recommending that we expand our national initiative to include every department, regardless of size or jurisdiction. It's ambitious, but it could have a nationwide impact." Reeves smiled slightly. This was the kind of progress he'd hoped for. Not just reform on paper, but real, tangible change that would ripple across the country. "That's exactly what we need," Reeves said, looking at the report in his hands. "Let's move forward with it. If we want to fix this system, we have to reach every corner of it." As the night wore on, Reeves couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. There was still much work to do, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that change was not only possible, it was already happening. As the months progressed, Reeves' determination to push for comprehensive reform within law enforcement continued to shape the trajectory of his leadership. The FBI's mental health initiative for officers had grown from a mere concept into a powerful, nationwide movement. The National Police Association had fully embraced the program, and the support from local and federal agencies alike had reached levels that Reeves hadn't initially anticipated. This newfound collaboration was a testament to the change he had sparked, but it was also a reminder that change was a constant struggle, one that required continued focus and persistence. By early spring, the National Task Force on Law Enforcement Mental Health was ready to roll out a pilot program in several major cities. The cities chosen, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and Miami, were large enough to present a challenge, but they also had the resources and infrastructure to implement the program effectively. Reeves was cautiously optimistic about its potential, but he knew that the real test would come when the program was scaled nationwide. The pilot program was designed to provide officers with mental health screenings on a regular basis, as well as immediate access to support systems for those struggling with personal or professional issues. Officers would be paired with counselors who had experience working specifically with law enforcement, and the program would offer a combination of individual therapy, peer support groups, and educational workshops focused on resilience and stress management. For the first time, the initiative was taking a comprehensive approach, focusing not just on crisis management but on prevention as well. Reeves couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment as he reviewed the early results. The response from officers who participated in the pilot program was overwhelmingly positive. Many had expressed feeling seen and supported in ways they never had before. The stigma surrounding mental health was starting to shift, albeit slowly. Some officers were still hesitant, unsure if they could trust the system, but others had openly shared their struggles with depression, anxiety, and burnout, which had been kept hidden for so long. There was still skepticism, though, particularly from some union leaders and senior officers who were worried about the long-term impact of these changes. They feared that such initiatives might expose vulnerabilities in their ranks, making them less effective in their primary mission of enforcing the law. These concerns were not easily dismissed, and Reeves found himself regularly meeting with union representatives, trying to convince them that mental health support wasn't about weakness, it was about strength, resilience, and the ability to continue serving with clarity and focus. "Director, we have to talk," Mitchell said one afternoon, as Reeves was sitting at his desk, reviewing the latest data from the pilot cities. "There's been pushback from the unions again. Some of them are demanding a halt to the mandatory mental health evaluations. They claim that officers are being unfairly targeted and scrutinized." Reeves leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This was the kind of resistance he had expected. Changing the culture of law enforcement wasn't going to be an easy or smooth process. "How are we handling it?" he asked, looking at Mitchell with a steady gaze. "We're engaging with them, trying to address their concerns directly. We're emphasizing that these screenings are confidential and voluntary in the early stages, but we still need to make them mandatory eventually. They're not seeing the bigger picture, Director." "I know," Reeves said, rubbing his forehead. "But this is a marathon, not a sprint. We're breaking down years, even decades, of ingrained attitudes. If we want to succeed, we need to keep pushing forward. We can't afford to let the unions derail this." He paused, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "Let's bring in the union leaders for another round of talks. Maybe it's time for them to hear directly from the officers who have benefited from the program. Let's show them the positive results." Mitchell nodded, clearly understanding the strategy. "I'll set it up." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, calls, and discussions. Reeves made a point to personally speak with several union representatives, reminding them that the goal of the mental health initiative wasn't to punish officers but to give them the support they needed to do their jobs effectively and had largely settled, but the shadow it cast over law enforcement began to soften, present, though it was clear that Reeves knew that as long as the issues surrounding officer mental health remained unresolved, those conversations would linger. The reform initiatives would be his legacy, but the task ahead was not just about policy, it was about ensuring that every officer, from the newest recruit to the most senior leader, understood and embraced the changes. It was about creating a culture where mental health wasn't just accepted but was woven into the fabric of law enforcement. By midsummer, the pilot program had seen tangible improvements. Officers reported a marked decrease in stress levels, better work-life balance, and a stronger sense of camaraderie with their colleagues. The anecdotal evidence was compelling. Officers who had previously been isolated were now part of supportive networks that helped them manage the emotional toll of their work. The early results from the cities involved in the pilot were promising, and Reeves was preparing to scale the initiative across the country. However, the implementation was not without challenges. Smaller departments, particularly those in rural areas, had struggled with the logistical challenges of providing adequate mental health support, given limited resources. Reeves had already begun working with the Department of Justice to ensure that federal funding could be allocated to assist smaller jurisdictions. The goal was for no department, no matter how large or small, to be left behind in the reform process. The summer heat was oppressive in Washington, D.C., but the air inside the FBI building was filled with a sense of purpose. Reeves stood in front of a large map of the United States, his finger tracing the growing number of cities and counties that were adopting the mental health initiative. As the program expanded, Reeves knew that it was beginning to take on a life of its own. The momentum was real, but there was still so much work to be done. Late one afternoon, as Reeves prepared to leave the office, Mitchell walked in again. This time, he was holding a letter, an official letter from the Department of Justice. Reeves had been expecting this for some time, but the weight of the moment still hung in the air. "What's this?" Reeves asked, taking the envelope from Mitchell's hands. "It's the formal approval for nationwide expansion," Mitchell said with a smile. "They're backing the initiative. It's going to happen, Director. It's going national." Reeves felt a surge of pride, but also a deep, humbling sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about him, it was about the officers who had finally been given the support they deserved, about the communities that could now trust their police force more than ever before. It was about the promise of a stronger, more resilient law enforcement system. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," Reeves said, looking out the window at the setting sun. "But we're on the right path. This is only the beginning." As he walked out of his office, his mind already turning to the next phase of implementation, Reeves knew that the road ahead would be long. But for the first time in a long time, he felt confident that real, lasting change was within reach. And that, after everything that had happened, was a victory worth fighting for.